inspired. I am. This is going to be one of my fangirl episodes because as you wade through our 2 seasons, you'll find that every time I have an investigative journalist on, I say things like democracy would not exist without investigative journalism. There would be no corporate accountability without investigative journalists. We would all be eating human flesh, probably, if it wasn't for investigative journalists. So thank you for your contribution. And it's no surprise to me now, 20 years into my career, that the commissioner of all things evil, Donald Trump, took aim at journalists early in his career, because wherever there's truth, there isn't Trump. So
that's a good line. That's a good line. Yeah.
But hey, that was an Ashley Lucan's original right now.
Okay. I agree with that one. I think I agree with that one.
Yeah. So tell us, where are you from? Where did you grow up? What's your origin story? What shaped Carey Gillam?
That's a really good question. And I have thought about some of that not too long ago, but so I'm a Kansas girl. I say I'm a Kansas girl. I'm a Kansas old woman, I guess. I was born in Kansas. I live in Kansas now.
You do?
I live in Kansas City.
Have you always lived in Kansas?
No. When I was 4 years old, my father moved us to Massachusetts. And I bounced around. I lived in a lot of different places when I was growing up. My mother was from Kansas. And so occasionally my father would bump us back to Kansas when he had sort of overseas, things going on. He did a lot of different jobs and worked overseas quite a bit. And so he would station us back at a very small little rural community called Chanute in Southeast Kansas, where my mom grew up. And we lived there, off and on a few different times. And I actually ended up graduating high school in Chanute, Kansas. But I also went to school in Dallas and other places. And then I went to school at the University of Kansas College to get my
Wow, you're like Kansas squared, Kansas triple booked.
Right. My journalism degree there. And of course, then I couldn't wait to get out of Kansas. And did and moved around a little bit. And then when I had my first baby, I moved back to Kansas to raise her here. So I've been back in Kansas now for 20 some years, and that's how Reuters got me covering agriculture and food and farming and Monsanto and all of that. But I do want to say, in reflecting on sort of where I am and how I've come to be sort of known, I guess, in terms of a reporter who focuses on environmental health, and environmental justice, and trying to hold corporations to account who, are polluting our food and water and air. Really, my dad, it's so interesting because my dad, before he passed in his retirement years, devoted himself to environmental advocacy and was incredibly passionate about it, and started a church-based environmental organization, and was always, kind of pushing me, and you should look at this, and you should do this, and you should do that. And I was always kind of pushing him away, I'm focused on my work, Dad, I'm focused on my work. And, he died 2 years ago, and I realized I'm doing exactly what he always was saying I needed to do. And I just hadn't realized it, just trying to bring truth to light and focusing on, what's so important to humanity and to our future generations and the health of our planet, issues. So long-winded answer, but,
Hi, Dad.
Little bit of Kansas,
calling in the ancestors.
A lot of my dad. Yeah.
So you got a degree in journalism. What sort of drew you there? For you, what was journalism an opportunity to do?
So I just always, knew I just always wanted to be a journalist. I was never one of those kids that said, gosh, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up, or maybe I want to be a school teacher. Maybe I just always wanted to be a journalist. I thought it sounded like the coolest job ever, and I loved to write and I loved to read. And I had a great respect for the power of the written word to transform and inform and educate. And I was just always really interested in different perspectives and different life experiences, and wanted to learn about the world and learn about people and issues. And journalism to me was the way to do that. And certainly in my career, particularly with Reuters, I was not only assigned to cover agriculture and agricultural issues, but I was a national correspondent. So I was deployed around the United States for different things. I covered the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and the tragedy and despair, just tremendous losses suffered by people. I did a lot of stories about parents and politics over the Iraq War. When our deceased soldiers were coming back, and opposition to the war was growing. And I was on the campaign trail for a little bit with Barack Obama when he was the new candidate, in 2007. So I was in the riots in Ferguson, Missouri. So I've gotten to be a witness to a lot of, I think, pieces of history, and then tell other people about it and get paid for it, right? So isn't that the greatest job ever? I just feel like it is.
Yeah. I mean, it's like the modern day investigator. You're like Sherlock Holmes, but for the world.
Yeah. Well, my investigative work, has really focused. I mean, I've done different things. So the banking industry, I did a lot of investigative work there, and transportation. But then, for the last 20 years, it's really been focused on pesticides in agriculture, and just the terrible sort of corruption that's gone on, and the lax regulatory system, and how it affects our human health and environmental health. It's just, so yeah, but I feel it's the only thing I'm good at. So, and I enjoy it. So it works out.
So let's just cut to the chase. Like, when did you start picking up the lead on corporate influence in agriculture? When did you start working on sort of writing about companies like Monsanto?
Yeah. So 1998, Reuters wanted me to start covering food and farming, agriculture. This company named Monsanto, Reuters brought me back to Kansas City, based me in Kansas City. Monsanto's just down the road in St. Louis, Missouri. And the company was transforming agriculture because it had introduced genetically engineered crops, these cool new corn and soybeans and cotton and canola that you could spray directly with a weed killer, an herbicide called Roundup, right, or glyphosate. And the weeds would die, but the crops wouldn't. And for farmers, this was just remarkable. And this was just the coolest new thing. And it made their lives so much easier. It gave them so much more time. And they were embracing it. And it was changing, markets and pricing models and decisions in the field about what kinds of crops farmers were going to grow. And it really was pretty transformative in mainstream and middle America in terms of the main crops that were being grown. And
were you interviewing those farmers at the time? Like, because I feel like when people think about the introduction of genetically engineered crops, they're imagining like a farmer that's sort of growing diversified crops on a small amount of land. But these are really like mega farms at this time.
Yeah, there's still smaller farms, but the big corn and soybean and wheat growing farms, these are, hundreds of acres, mostly thousands of acres. These farmers are in it big time. And yeah, I spent a lot of time with farmers, lots and lots. Farmers taught me, this essentially from the ground up, as well as grain handlers and distributors and agronomists and scientists who study this, agricultural economist. I was based on the trading floor and talked to commodities traders and watched futures and cash prices move, depending on different things happening in the market. And Monsanto had me into their headquarters a lot, to have me meet with their experts and teach me what they wanted me to know, right? And what they thought I should be writing. And so did the other companies, Dow and DuPont and Syngenta. So, I learned and I studied and I spent a lot of time just immersing myself in the industry. And, to get back to your question, it over time, because I didn't come at this with any preconceived notions. I didn't know anything about food and farming, really. But over time, I came to realize and understand that what I was hearing from the companies didn't match up exactly with what was happening on the ground. And that while this new technology might be really beneficial to farmers in certain ways, there were also, detriments to farmers and there were risks. And then you started to see problems in the ecosystem developing because of this wide use of GMO crops and this wide use of this chemical glyphosate that was sprayed directly on these fields now, and what it was doing to the soil and to pollinators. And the science started developing about what it might mean for human health. And you start seeing more concerns raised about disease. I mean, it just, it's as everything started to mount that maybe this all isn't all just a wonderful, feel-good, happy story. Maybe there's another side to it. And shouldn't we be looking at both sides? And shouldn't we be taking into account the benefits and the risks in our public policies? The companies started coming after me, and it got really heated and really intense. And they really wanted me to shut up. I had a very big platform because I worked for Reuters. I mean, millions of readers around the world, and markets traded to a great degree on what was being reported from Reuters or competitors like Bloomberg and Dow Jones. And so, it became a really heated, intense environment, which is.
I think for our listeners, it's important to first establish this relationship between glyphosate use and the introduction of genetically engineered crops, because I think for a lot of people, genetically engineered crops was like about fighting climate change or making drought resistant crops or feeding the world. But what you were seeing in the American Midwest was something different.
Well, everything that you've just said is exactly what the companies say. Yes, these are needed to feed the world, these genetically engineered crops. And they kept telling me, we're going to develop genetically engineered crops that will tolerate drought, or that will be, yield enhancing, that will fight crop disease, that will be, all of that was, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. But at the time, in the late 90s and in the 2000s and in the mid 2000s, and still to this day, the main genetically engineered crop that's sold, grown, planted around the world are crops that are designed to be sprayed with chemicals, glyphosate and other herbicides, mainly glyphosate. They're designed to sell more weed killer, to sell more pesticides. They're not mainly designed to do anything else except be sprayed directly with weed killer. And that was a fact then, it's a fact now. The second sort of biggest type of genetically engineered crop is one that makes the plant toxic to insects, so that the plant itself, as the insect feeds on it, is toxic, and the insect then dies. So, in terms of being more nutritious or being more beneficial to the environment or that sort of thing, no, those don't exist. They didn't exist then. They don't exist now. It's a talking point, but it's not true. And this is sort of the tension point, as I started understanding that and pointing that out and making that case, the companies got really angry about it. And I think you're saying with glyphosate, it is good for people to understand. Glyphosate was introduced, it's the main ingredient in Roundup, was introduced in the 1970s by Monsanto as an herbicide, as a weed killer. And it became popular and widely used because it was much safer than some other weed killers that farmers and people were using. But the patent was expiring. Monsanto's patent was expiring in the year 2000. And they were experimenting on these different, crops and seeds, and they wanted to expand into that part of agriculture. And so they came up with this genetically engineered, let's make the crops tolerate glyphosate. And then we can package it. We can call it a Roundup Ready system. And we can have Roundup Ready corn and Roundup Ready soy. And so it will preserve and enhance our ability to sell glyphosate, to sell Roundup. We'll keep our hold on that market, even though our patent is expiring. And we'll have this whole new market with GMO crops. And it was brilliant. And they made billions of dollars. It was a brilliant, brilliant strategy. But it led to an overuse of glyphosate that led to a demise of bees and butterflies that are necessary for pollination, to a lot of damage to the microorganisms in the soil, to the nutrient values of the crops, led to residues being left in the foods that we consume, crackers and cereals and breads and oatmeal and a whole array of things like that. So we're now consuming a lot of glyphosate in our food. It's prevalent now in our water sources. Our US government scientists find glyphosate in rainfall because it's so ubiquitous. Weeds have become resistant to it over time. Millions of acres of farmland now have weeds that are resistant to glyphosate. So farmers have to put on other weed killers and other herbicides on top of glyphosate. It's just kind of spiraled into this issue. And oh, by the way, the World Health Organization scientists say it causes cancer if you're exposed to it. So, something we thought was really great in the 1990s, maybe now doesn't look so great.
So what was take me back. Here you are, young journalist, just assigned to the ag beat, living in Kansas, down the road from Monsanto. Yeah. In sort of, I would imagine this is like the golden age of glyphosate and GE crops.
Right.
The wool hasn't the wool is still over our eyes. What was the first moment when you were like, I think we're being lied to?
The first time, well, there were a couple times. I mean, the whole bovine growth hormone, Monsanto, I don't even know if people remember this, the RBGH. Monsanto came up with this great hormone kind of thing that you would inject into dairy cows and it would make them produce a whole lot of milk. They produce more milk than normal. And everybody said, oh, it's great, it's fine, there's no problems with it. And it turned out that, the cows, the dairy cows were getting sort of infections then in their udders and other things. And then you were having pus in the milk and you were having more antibiotics. Then they have to give your cows more antibiotics. And it just wasn't the greatest thing. So that was kind of the first, this company says this is great. It's not really great. But the one that really was most clear to me was when Monsanto, after they'd already introduced Roundup Ready corn and soy and cotton, they wanted to introduce Roundup Ready wheat. And so they were working on genetically engineering wheat, and they were going to roll that out to the world. And the trouble was the world didn't want it. Wheat growers didn't want an herbicide-resistant wheat. And I went to all of these meetings with wheat farmers and Monsanto executives, and the wheat farmers were saying, weeds are not our problem. We don't want to pay more for a special type of seed to help us so we can spray our wheat directly with glyphosate so we'll have fewer weeds. We don't want that. We would like a genetically modified wheat that fights disease. That would be great if you could give us that, Monsanto. And Monsanto said, no, you're going to take Roundup Ready wheat. That's what we want you to have. And the wheat industry, it really roiled the wheat industry, and export markets were saying, if you're growing genetically modified wheat, we're not going to buy it. It became a real big thing. And that, to me, watching that pressure campaign on the American farmer by Monsanto, I think that's what really finally said to me, this is not about the farmer. This is not about anything except corporate profit. And what they're saying to the public is really different than what's being said behind closed doors in these meetings and to farmers. And so I think that was probably the real turning point for me.
So you start writing these articles for Reuters about sort of this emerging truth or realization you're having. did you get pushback from your editors at first? Like, how was the company responding? And how did that show up for you editorially?
Yeah, I mean they and again, I wasn't writing opinion pieces or columns, you know, I was just writing news stories. But I was, you know, quoting people other than Monsanto, you know, and I was quoting people who didn't always agree and critics. So I would quote both sides, you know, of these issues, and I would write about scientific studies that were showing harm, and I would write about, you know, weed scientists and farmers and others who were seeing problems in the fields who were reporting it. And so what happened, Monsanto started really, hammering me, hammering the editors. They called my story, they said that I was engaging in false balance, that in quoting the other side, that I was following a false balance, and that the other side didn't have valid views or valid opinions, that really the only truth and the only real factual information worth reporting came from Monsanto's side. And so I shouldn't really give much time or
I've heard that line before.
yeah, false balance. So, you know, that was kind of the line and the pushback. And you know, they pushed back on my editor and myself for many, many years. Over time, you know, they started developing these websites, front groups and websites designed to, and it wasn't just me, of course. I mean, as the years rolled on, it became apparent to lots of reporters and lots of people, scientists and others. And so they started developing these front groups and these websites to attack me and other people and criticize our work.
I've been a proud feature on those websites too, Carey.
Yeah. So you know what I'm talking about. It's ugly, but it's also, I guess, a bit of a badge of honor that they think, you know, we're worth attacking.
Well, I think one of the things that I got, you know, I took the job with Center for Food Safety right after I had finished my PhD. And my PhD had really focused on the logic of corporate power. And I had been reading Naomi Klein, and I gave all of the money I received for my wedding to Amy Goodman. And so I'd been following Democracy Now! And just like her great work for years, like a fangirl. And so I knew that there was a playbook out there, that like what large corporations do is they shoot the messenger. They completely ignore the message. But I wasn't aware of how it would feel. The things that were said about me during my more high profile times were wild.
Yeah.
Wild. Yeah. And as a woman, I mean, now we have these things like Me Too and Donald Trump to point to say like, this is how power reduces a woman and makes her feel small in order for her to be silent. Like, as these companies started to go after you, like, what was that moment? Like, how did you fortify yourself, not only to keep going, but to actually like grow your advocacy so significantly?
Yeah. I mean, everything you've said, it's shocking, right? The level of just outright lies and things that how low they will stoop to put these things out there and push them around on social media and websites and things. But I don't know. I mean, I think being a female journalist, I was already, I mean, from the earliest days, you know, I covered the banking industry. I covered some of the largest bank holding companies in the country when I was pretty young. And I was a little blonde reporter in little blue business suit with my pumps and my pantyhose. Dear God, we used to wear pantyhose. And, you know, quite often these bank executives thought that they could intimidate me, or they could tell me what to write, or that I would just write what they told me to write. And if I didn't, they would get really, really angry. Right. And so I think very early on, I developed a pretty thick skin, or I think my dad raised me with a thick skin, but to know, do your best, tell the truth, be focused on the facts, and, what happens, right? And you can't be afraid to make people mad. You can't be afraid to have people say bad things about you or try to hurt your feelings. You just have to stay focused on the task and do your job with the most, integrity and focus on the truth. And that's just what I always did. But I mean, certainly when you see things written about you and you know that people are going to read them and they're going to wonder if they're true, and you meet people and you don't know if, it's an uncomfortable, unpleasant kind of thing. And I sure wish we didn't have that happen. But it's the nature of the beast, I think. Monsanto, we found out when my first book came out, they had a whole spreadsheet internally devoted to this attack plan on how to, go after me, go after the book. And they had a consulting company they brought in from DC, and they had all of these different, it was crazy. It's like, I'm one little person, and knowing they did that to me and you or whomever, it's part of the playbook, as you said. And it's really outrageous and hard. But I think you do, as a woman in particular, perhaps a man. I mean, I don't want to be sexist or whatever, but I think as a woman in particular, from where you come from, men just are used to kind of trying to put women in their place. And you just have to be steeled against it. I remember when I worked in the trading floor, for the Board of Trade, commodities traders, I came to love many of them and be good friends with them, but I mean, they are like, I don't even know, rabid dogs. I mean, they are just the vulgarity and the outright, and the profanity, and they had no qualms whatsoever about just laying it all out there to see if they could shock me or scare me off the floor, or, you gotta.
I can totally see this Carey Gillam in her powder blue business suit with her pantyhose and pumps. And I can totally imagine the way they felt they could control you.
Yeah.
And like the type of, I want to say it's in the best, and largest form of ego, but like the ego tolerance you had to develop at that age to be like, okay, you think you're playing me right now. I'll play the part, but I also will transcend it through my work.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. I mean, certainly, this is going to areas where I haven't talked about for 20 years, I guess, or so. But yeah, when I was younger and I was attractive, I could get indoors, a banker was going to, sit down and talk with me.
I bet.
And I could get indoors that maybe some other people couldn't. And then they were shocked as hell, when I might write down what they actually said and quote them on something maybe, they hadn't meant to say because they were opening up. I don't know. But
I actually feel like we finally have in the zeitgeist, though, these stories that are increasingly being told, like in She Said, for example, where you see the way that women can sort of bait and switch the patriarchy in order to tell the compelling stories that these dominant male logics like capitalism and patriarchy are producing. The hubris of genetically engineered crops and glyphosate is, for me, so quintessentially patriarchal that we can dominate and control through power, nature, and agricultural systems. And similarly, that we can dominate and control people by, perpetuating these false narratives. I see them as interlinked.
I think very much so. Yeah. And I mean, corporations taking away, the woman man sort of situation, but you're right. I mean, with the media in particular, corporations quite often, like Monsanto did, will have media days or media tours or media this, and they'll bring these reporters in and wine them and dine them and teach them how to write about the company and teach them how to write about different issues. And then there's a carrot and stick approach. So if you're the good reporter and you write about these things the way that they want you to, they reward you and they'll give you access, so you'll land a scoop. They'll give you a scoop, or they'll give you a CEO interview, and it makes you look good with your bosses. And you get, if you're the bad reporter and you don't write what they want you to, they shut you out. They shut you down. They not only come after you and harass you and your editors, but they deny you interviews. They deny you, so it's harder for you to do your job. So there's a huge component of control of media that is just very directly part of the playbook and the strategy by these big companies. And as you said,
it's funny when you were describing that, I'm like, they do that with legislators and politicians too. I mean,
exactly.
and I guess, and we can sort of close the loop on this. I do feel like as women, as young women, as beautiful women, there's this double bind that we're in, where, I just felt consistently trivialized in the way I was represented. And, they had paid these sort of bloggers, these, through the Genetic Literacy Project and the Cornell Alliance for Science, had hired these people in Hawaii to act as if they were the citizen journalists that were really truth-telling on these issues.
Right.
And, one line was mocking my education as if I was like, not there. Every one blogger would write, oh, PhD in political science, Ashley Lukens, like that made me a joke. And then the other was that I was having sex at the legislature to get bills passed.
I never heard that one. Oh my gosh.
And all over social media in hush comments, oh, well, we know how she gets her job done. And I remember feeling like at the time, if I hadn't been in therapy with like a really strong internal compass and like belief in myself, it would have destroyed me, because I was so young, because I had no career to stand on. That was the beginning of my career. And I think about all of the women they've silenced through those behind the scenes, in the comments strategy, because everybody was like, oh, it's no big deal. They're just writing. Nobody pays attention to the comments section. And I'm like, yeah, but I do. Yeah. So what are they trying to do to me?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And we've seen that play out with reporters and other people. I mean, I think maybe it's more common to walk away, to retreat when you're faced with that sort of thing, rather than to carry forward and just continue to walk into the fire. The people that I know who face that sort of thing, most of them walk away. Most of them back off.
Totally. They switch their beat. They write about something different.
Yeah, it's easier. It's a lot easier. It would have been a lot easier for me. I mean, I had probably not to that degree, I hope. Gosh, I don't know. I try not to read all the things.
The comments.
I try to avoid it. But there were times, I mean, I got some threats, some threatening emails and crazy people. And yeah, there were times I was afraid. I mean, there were maybe a year I spent wondering, should I keep going? Should I not? I was afraid to leave the house. I wondered if, the black sedan outside was,
totally. This is like triggering me in some weird way, but I was so fucking paranoid for years. I mean, I don't know if you know this about me, but I was diagnosed with brain cancer after all of this. And that was like, I see it directly related to the level of harassment I was receiving all the time. And I like think about that brain tumor as like this obsessive little circuit that I couldn't stop in my mind all the time, wondering like, am I going to be okay? And like, for me, again, it was, am I going to have a job?
Yeah.
I mean, I want to tie like the fact that you do this for a living. Like, did you ever feel scared that they were going to ruin your career and you were going to be like destitute?
Yes, for sure. I mean, at Reuters, they caused so much craziness at the end. My editor who hired me, who was my editor forever, got promoted, and they brought in a brand new guy from outside the company who hadn't really done this work, and he was not at all, I remember him saying to me, no one cares about glyphosate, Roundup, GMO crops, like this is not important, like just stop writing about this stuff. I was
Oy
like,
vey.
are you insane? Like this is a global issue. Like this is being debated, and this is affecting farming practices and export markets and global trade and health concerns. Are you insane? And Monsanto kept, and so they just started pushing him and pushing him and pushing him. And he did at one point tell me he was going to reassign me to a different beat. And I went over his head to his boss in New York, and they said, absolutely not. We're going to keep her on the beat. But then he and I just continued just head to head fight. And right before the International Agency for Research on Cancer declared glyphosate to be a probable human carcinogen, and this explosion of litigation happened, bringing in 100,000 people around the country. Right before that was when he was saying to me, I was writing about another scientific study, and he was like, just stop. No one cares about it. It's never going to be a story. It's never going to be anything. So just stop. And I was like, no, I'm not going to stop. And then everything exploded,
And then you were like, ha ha ha, I told you so.
I mean, I just don't. And he's not at Reuters anymore. I'm not at Reuters anymore. I left. I wrote 2 books. I'm writing now for The Guardian and this other news outlet that I started, the new Lede. But I'm glad. But yeah, he and Monsanto made the last year or so of working for Reuters really, really difficult.
What do you think, like, as we think about the fabric necessary to move the needle on this industrial agriculture model that is, as Andy likes to say, a zombie paradigm, and it's dying anyway, but we all kind of want to put the knife through the heart now. Like, what do you think is needed to support the level of journalism that is required to help tell the truth to the world about these crops?
Well, sadly, or maybe not sadly, I guess, it is true that conventional journalism really doesn't have the appetite, pun intended, or the funding, the drive to pursue these sorts of issues. And they do have the pressure of, the corporations breathing down their necks. It's really taking nonprofit journalism outlets, funded or backed by groups that care about the environment and about human health, to drive this kind of journalism. And that's actually why the new Lede, this new outlet that I launched last year with the Environmental Working Group, because the founder, Ken Cook, saw this, has seen this in the landscape, and the shrinking news holes, the shrinking staff at newspapers and news outlets. You just saw NPR lay off a whole bunch of people. ABC News just laid off a whole bunch of people. Newspapers around the country have been dying. So I think it's nonprofit journalism. It's the Intercept, right? It's ProPublica. It's Investigate Midwest.
Yeah.
The new
here
Lede.
in Hawaii, it's called the Civil Beat, also funded by
Right.
Pierre Omidyar, who funds the Intercept.
Yeah. So, and the Guardian, to a degree. So it's up to the people, right? To fund these news organizations to bring the truth home that these large outlets aren't doing.
I know I was thinking a lot about the New York Times coverage of George Santos. I don't know if you read that, but he's the fucking, just lunatic that was elected into Congress, and
everything about him is a lie.
everything about him is a lie.
Yeah.
So many good memes going around the internet right now. But they actually lamented the loss of local journalism inside of their own outlet as a part of what allowed him to get elected. And they have been repeatedly in the coverage taking responsibility for the fact that they no longer have the staff necessary to deeply investigate candidates at a local level. And for me, there's just been all of those canaries in the information coal mine that have been coming out that are like, the for-profit media model is driving the demise of our democracy, of our environment. And the only way to really shift the tide on that is to shift the model whereby journalism is produced and consumed. Mm-hmm. And after that, I went and subscribed to my local newspaper and like upped my donation to our nonprofit news outlet, because I was like, as an activist, I could have done nothing that I did if the Civil Beat journalist who had been covering pesticides and GE crops had not sat down with me and walked through the data. Everybody had been covering it as if we were like anti-technology,
right,
Luddites. But I walked this woman through the government data on GE field trials and pesticide use and helped her see the link. And it forever changed the conversation. But that level of time and dedication to learning the issue, it's just not available, I feel like, anymore for large news outlets that are really only covering like global news.
Yeah, I feel like they've become, it's more about the game, than like the game of politics, who's on top, who's not, who's winning, who's losing, as opposed to what are the issues behind the game. What is the truth? Where does the truth lie? And I mean, when I started writing about glyphosate and the health concerns and the soil problems and all of that, I think I was one of the only journalists probably in the world. Like so many other journalists were like, no, that's not right. These are the greatest things ever. But little by little, other people start seeing, oh, well, here's the study, that was pointed to, or here's this, or here's that. And I still remember when my book Whitewash came out about Monsanto and the corporate corruption and the environmental, the regulatory just disaster and just all of that. All these journalists who were interviewing me about the book were very skeptical. And they're like, they didn't believe it, I guess. And it's like, well, what do you not believe? Every single thing in there is documented, backed up, indexed, none of it is my opinion at all. So what is it you don't believe? And a few years went by, and then people are interviewing me and go, wow, like everything was true. Like everything in your book is true. It's all in. And I think it helped changes the conversation, which is what you're saying. Journalists, we need to get back to what journalism is supposed to be about.
Right? Yeah. I mean, I always think about, I used to teach the politics of the media when I was a PhD student at UH Hawaii. And the sole assignment for the class was to read the headlines of Democracy Now! Every day. And then we would come and discuss the headlines and then look at how large-scale media outlets were covering it and like talk about the structural differences. And that would be how we would talk about ideology and all of these larger framing concepts. But it occurred to me that it seems we've lost faith in the truth, that there is actually a truth. It's like the concept of truth is now up for debate. And it's why it's like.
Exactly. It's a social construct. Truth. You have your own truth. Everybody has their own truth, and you're supposed to respect everybody's truth. I mean, I think we've seen it play out in so many different ways. right?
Well, I mean, it makes, like, I was going to say it, and even though I know all of this and I've taken classes and classes and classes of students through the shift in mindset when you are getting independent nonprofit news media into your brain, how it changes the way you see your own world. I myself now, even when I read the New York Times, or which depends on who you ask, the New York Times is either like a corporate media lackey who never does any good investigative journalism, or a liberal like scheme to corrupt the world according to the Democratic cabal. So there's no perfect outlet, but
Right.
even when I read them, I'm like, oh, this is the way conservatives are going to read this story. This is the way that, I think our literacy, our ability to digest information in this era of like AI and is it real and fake news, it's making activism harder because everything feels up for debate. And I think actually, I mean, if I'm going to continue this rant, COVID made it a million times more worse because it was like, I don't know how to be a sophisticated, nuanced thinker when everything is up for debate. There is no respectable truth teller anymore.
Mm-hmm. No, I could not agree with you more. And I think if we're allowed to say COVID, yes, I think I blame the government. I blame governments for that, because being a sophisticated, nuanced thinker was actively discouraged during COVID.
Yes.
By all of our government leaders, right? Don't think for yourself. Don't try to look at the data. Don't try to apply logic. Don't try to apply your own human experience. Don't consider your own human health. Don't consider, just do what we tell you to do, right? And now we're finding out through the Twitter files and others just how adamantly our government was suppressing, dialogue and debate and discussion. If your listeners haven't looked at the Twitter files, I encourage you to do that. That terrifies me to see that the FBI and the CDC and other arms of our government were communicating with Twitter and Facebook and others about, who should be allowed to speak, who should be allowed to post, whose posts should be suppressed. That's just, it's not democracy, and it's not the America I was raised to believe in. And it goes back to journalism. I got so many during COVID. We're going on a different road here, I guess, but during COVID, I was one of those people who was really skeptical early on. I was questioning, and I was a little bit afraid, but I was also I really want to see the data. So every single day I'm looking at our health department data for Kansas, and I'm tracking what they're saying the cases are and the demographics and who's getting it and who's not and who's hospitalized and who's not. And I'm seeing these, we're probably okay. My kids are probably okay. The statistics are, so I'm not going to freak out. Maybe we shouldn't be locked down. And I really don't think that you should be able to go to a gun store, but you can't go to a hair salon. Like, I really don't see the logic in that. I had a lot of questions, and my journalistic friends, people at Reuters, were just appalled at me asking questions. How dare you? You're killing people. Don't ask questions. Don't have any.
It was a very weird time. I mean, I lived in this. I mean, I'll take it out of the COVID context and describe my experience with cancer, which was very similar, because somebody gets a cancer diagnosis like brain cancer, and everybody goes into a neurotic place. And the people that were more inclined to distrust and question were like, don't do chemo, it's poison, don't do radiation, don't do surgery. This is all a scam. Maybe you're going to get abducted by aliens. And it just felt like this huge pressure to use my personal health decision through their kind of like neurotic frame. And on the other side, it was like, how dare you approach this integratively? And what do you mean that cancer is a function of the Western, you're crazy, you're anti-science, you're anti-progress. And I was like, I am going to weave my own journey through this using the one thing I have always been able to rely on in my life, my mind. And I need to be able to take each choice on my own, thoughtfully, like consider my options, consider the data, and like that type of thinking and the permission to think and act that way is being actively eroded in so many ways. It's being eroded in our medical system. It's being eroded in our education system. And so it's like, I'm not for like a prescription of reality that's right. I want the permission to think about it myself and try to make choices that weigh my own personal health and well-being against the health and well-being of the collective. And it does feel like this entire system of information is eroding our ability to like continue to ask those hard questions and not be caricatured for it.
Right. No, I certainly think that's true. And it is a hard thing to navigate. And, a lot of times when people will ask me, well, how do we do that? How do we navigate that? How do we know what's true and what's not true? Right. Because you do want to have the ability to discern for yourself, as you say, to use your mind and your perspective and your abilities to do your own research. But that's really important, right? And so to find the truth, you do have to have trusted sources in the media. Well, who are they? There's so many efforts out there to contaminate that pool. What is real? What isn't? And read scientific studies, read journals, like read as much as you can, right? And I think the red flags of groups that are so dominant, there's only one way to believe, there's only one thing that you can think, there's only one perspective. That's a red flag for sure, I think, right? I don't know, but
yeah, it's like,
and attacks on journalists or attacks on activists or other people that are personal in nature, where you're just trying to, dissuade somebody from reading them or trusting them when it's not about the facts, when they're just going after you personally. To me, that's a real red flag, that's not a site to be trusted for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. It just seems like what we're pointing at and what your career is a testament to is the broader democratic function of public education, not inside of public education institutions, but through the media. It's like back in the day, the function of the media was just to inform people about what happened in their world and give them the information so that they could make their own decisions and make those decisions wisely. And it does seem as though that function has been eroded.
Certainly. Maybe that's the message of this podcast episode, right? If people are going to fight for anything, they should fight for, again, freedom of, do we call it freedom of speech? I mean, it sounds so fundamental, but freedom of speech and
the freedom of the press, both.
Press, which is all entwined, but the government suppression of information and trying to control it. And it's really, really frightening to me. And it almost is something that seems insurmountable. I hope it's not. I hope people care and they're not just retreating to their own caves with their own ideologies, where we're sort of locked into this right versus left, or, white and black, and there's no gray, there's no middle ground that we want to have conversations in anymore. Like, I hope that's not where we are, but it seems like we're headed there for sure.
It definitely feels scary right now to engage with those who disagree with us. I agree. And I don't know, like I would say for me, it is about advocating for these essential functions in a democracy that have been like carved out and protected and neat. And, Arundhati Roy says our freedoms were never given to us by any government. They've been wrested by us. And if we do not test them from time to time, they will atrophy. And if we do not fight for more and more, we will be left with less and less. And that feels like what we need to understand and exercise in this moment is that we have to be pushing and advocating even at the same, or it's going to constantly be eroding. And part of the way we can do that is by amplifying and practicing those functions in our daily life. Because I think we're going to produce the next generation of journalists by inviting our children into the practice of critical thinking, and figuring things out themselves. And I don't know if they're getting that at school either,
Yeah, I certainly hope so. I don't think so right now, at least what I see. Again, in our educational system, it seems very dogmatic. We seem to be that there's that struggle, but it's you must think one way. You're seeing it in colleges as well, universities as well as in elementary, middle, high school, where
we're banning books and banning liberal arts schools.
I know, exactly. We're telling children what it's okay to think about and how they should think about it. And it's frightening. We're the only way I think that we advance is when we do have intelligent and respectful debate and dialogue. Debate is not something to shy away from, it's something to embrace. But you do it in a respectful manner and you try to learn from each other and you try to understand. And that is not in fashion right now, I don't think.
Yep. Well, thank you for spending the hour with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I appreciate, I recognize a lot of this work for you is personal, that it's become sort of your legacy and your life's work. And as a woman who continues to organize, I stand on your shoulders, because without you telling the truth, despite all of the pressure for you to sit down and shut up, you refuse. And we need more refusers at this point.
Well, you too, right? Back at you. I think we all are doing what we can do in our own little way, or we should be, right? To contribute light and truth, and hopefully create a better future for the kids, and not the darkness that it seems we might descend into at times. So I think what you're doing is very important, and I'm really grateful you had me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah. The Hero's Journey is brought to you by the Center for Food Safety. Production by Julia Ranney and Ashley Lukens. Editing and social media by Amanda Lillibridge, Duray Shin, and Annalisa Camacho. Theme song by Walker Lukens and Adam Mason, and audio engineering by Adam Mason. You can find us across all podcast platforms and follow us at Center for Food Safety on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, and CFS True Food on Twitter. We're on the web at theheroesjourneypodcast.com. Do you have a hero you'd like to see on the podcast? Fill out the form in the show notes or email us at theheroesjourneypod@gmail.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, like and subscribe, and make sure you'll never miss an episode. We'll see you in a few weeks.